Hello everyone, Professor Kurzlik here. So I wanted to make a video regarding this week's reading. So we're going to begin with a basic but important question. A seemingly simple question to ask that we've wrestled with throughout the semester. And that is, who actually has power over public policy in the United States? A question that our authors, our readings have looked at in a lot of different ways. So in a democracy, this answer seems simple and straightforward. We tend to assume that ordinary citizens, through voting, through participation, through voicing their thoughts, through public opinion polls, shape what government does. And we've talked about and we've seen that some theories argue that that is the case. These ideas that it is the people themselves are and is a core democratic ideal, that policy reflects the will of the people. And as simple as that, the public policy represents and reflects the will of the people. The readings for this week, though, this pretty famous piece by Gilens and Page, ask us, though, to take a step back and examine whether that assumption holds in practice and whether that the assumption that we hold with democracy plays out in reality. So their central question is relatively simple and, again, straightforward, but it goes and it really takes us to the heart of American politics. When it comes to public policy, when it comes to public policy decisions, whose preferences actually matter? So to answer this question, our two authors compare four major ways of thinking about political power within the United States. Theories that we've encountered and talked about and investigated and have found their way into our reading. So the first is majoritarian electoral democracy, which argues that public policy reflects the preferences of average citizens. In this view, elections are the key mechanism. Politicians want to win votes, they want to win re-election, so they respond to what the majority wants. This, when we think of politics, when we think of the role of elected officials, is what we probably think about. When we've talked about this majoritarian view in the classroom, we've talked about how elected officials will do what their voters want because they want to be popular, because they want to win re-election. And that mechanism, which might sound nefarious, is what just elected officials do to become popular or to remain popular or to win re-election. And it's as simple as that. In that way, they do what their constituency wants, what the average citizen wants. So when we think of the majoritarian view of democracy, that's oftentimes what we think about. So the second preference that our authors bring up is economic elite domination. So this view suggests that policy is shaped primarily by wealthy individuals, those with significant income, significant resources, and importantly, access to those policy decision makers, access to those with institutional power. So the third that the authors bring up is majoritarian pluralism, which argues that policy is shaped by competition among many interest groups, but that these groups broadly represent the public. Even if individuals do not act directly, or maybe they themselves don't have a lot of power, their interests are expressed through these organizations. And finally, the fourth evaluation that Gilens and Page look at is biased pluralism. So this perspective also emphasizes interest groups, but it argues that not all groups are equal. Business groups and corporations tend to dominate and have more power, while groups representing ordinary citizens are weaker and less influential. When we talk about this in class, we talk about maybe organizations that we are members of. Organizations like the Sierra Club or many of those interest groups that we looked at, and we discovered that, hey, there's an interest group for basically anything that we have a affiliation with. So that fourth category is looking at interest groups saying they don't all have power equally. So what Gilens and Page do in their study is test these theories against each other using a relatively large data set of nearly 1,800 policy issues over a 20-year period. They compare the preferences of average Americans, average citizens, affluent Americans, as a proxy of economic elites and organized interest groups, and then they examine which of these preferences are most closely associated with actual policy outcomes. So at first glance, the results might seem to support all of the theories. When each group is considered separately, it appears that public opinion matter, that elites matter, and that interest groups do matter. But the key contribution of the article, and why, like we talked about in class, the authors were interviewed on NPR. It made circles within and outside the policy-making apparatus, is because their key contribution is the article that it analyzes all of these actors at the same time. And when the authors do that, the picture changes. At least they argue that the picture changes quite significantly. The authors argue that the influence of average citizens largely disappears. Once you account for the preferences of economic elites and organized interest groups, the preferences of ordinary Americans have little or no independent effect on policy outcomes. By contrast, economic elites and organized interest groups continue to have strong, statistically significant effects on public policy. So this is the central finding of the article, and it has important implications. And again, this is why that this article made headlines when it was published, again, inside and outside of the public policy realm. The authors, the article does not mean, and they do not argue, that citizens never get what they want. In fact, the authors argue that average citizens oftentimes do get what they want. But the key issue, they argue, is causation. Citizens may appear to win because their preferences often align with those of elites. Sorry, my dog's here. She wants to play. She doesn't understand it's work time. When that happens, policy reflects both groups' preferences, but it is the elites who are driving the outcome. So according to our authors, the relationship between public opinion and policy can be thus misleading. It can look like citizens are influencing policy when in reality they are benefiting from decisions driven by more policy actors. So this connects to our broader theme of the course. Power in America, in power in general, is not broadly distributed. The reading shows that influence over policy tends to be more concentrated among actors with resources organization, and again, with access. Economic elites have financial resources, have those networks, and have direct channels to policymakers. Organized interest groups, especially business groups, we use the example of a few particular business groups. They do have the ability to lobby, provide information, fund campaigns, and remain consistently engaged in the policy-making progress. So they do have some sway. Average citizens, the authors argue, by contrast, oftentimes lack these advantages. They may have preferences, but they face significant barriers when it comes to translating those preferences into actual political influence and actual public policy making. So our article also highlights the role of interest groups in shaping policy. It finds that interest groups have a substantial independent effect on policy outcomes, but the system is again not balanced. Business-oriented groups are more numerous, they're better funded, and more consistently active than groups representing ordinary citizens. Thus, as a result, the interest group system is tilted towards those with economic power. So this supports the idea of biased pluralism. Policy is shaped through a competition among groups. Sorry, she's still playing with her toys. But the playing field is again not equal. Some interest groups, some types of interest groups simply have more resources, better access to power. So another important takeaway from the reading that we have to consider is the role of institutions. The U.S. political system has a strong status quo bias because of the separation of powers, because of federalism and procedural roles. It is difficult to pass new policies. Sorry, she's destroying her toy at my feet. Miss, we're recording. Sorry. Even when there are large majorities of Americans who support a policy change, that change oftentimes does not occur. In fact, the article argues that even when an overwhelming majority favor a policy, the probability of change oftentimes remains relatively low. So the authors argue that this tells us that public support alone is not enough to really shape that public policy. Instead, policy change requires more than just majority opinion. It requires, again, organization, resources, and access to decision makers. Something we've seen emerge and come up over the course of the semester. From one case study to another, we've seen these ideas emerge. So then we have to ask ourselves, what does this all mean for how we understand American democracy? Gilens and Page are careful in their conclusions, but their findings do raise some important discussions in American politics. They argue that the United States clearly has democratic institutions. We know that elections, rights, participation, but they argue that the distribution of influence over policy is unequal. And that's the takeaway that the authors want us to have. Now, we know there are rebuttals, like we talked about in class, to these arguments. And further scholars had came out and said, no, the certain variables are missing. Certain ways of categorizing what are in the elites is wrong. So that's not to say there is not pushback against this article, and others have written extensively, pushing back. But at least we want to, as we think about who holds power in the American political system, at least spend a little bit of time thinking about this this article, because it is an interesting and relevant political science. Jeez, sorry, my dog. Relevant political science article. Thank you.